This is cassette number 2, talking with Mr. John Allen, May 5th, 1993. All right, Mr. Allen, will you continue with your story?
Well, when Colonel Wilson said we were going to get a high-ranking officer to come out and take command, he said he didn't know who he was, but that he should have an imposing house. We were living in what I thought were pretty good quarters, made of bamboo with thatch roofs, but he thought his should be apart, so he selected a very imposing site up on the hillside, an old abandoned Naga field, and I said, Colonel, it'll take 30 minutes to walk up to that damn place, and you'll have to rest for 30 more before you can turn around and come back. Well, he thought that would be it, so he built a fine bamboo house up there with Naga labor, and I never went to see it. Well, we had gotten pretty lax about military courtesy and discipline out there. There wasn't a great deal of need for it. The only other American officer besides those with Dr. Seagrave at the hospital was a liaison officer. With each Chinese regiment there had one, and we had one for the 114th and one for the 112th. With one exception, they were all very nice people. They had no command authority, but they just supposed to see that relations with the Chinese worked smoothly and to give them advice where they could. We had a hard time getting clothing. Shoes wouldn't last a month, and you had to have hobnails in them, and it was wet or you couldn't stand up. So I was just practically in rags, and I said, my God, I don't have any clothes. But I had my little Naga boy, a little while long, about 8 or 10 years old, who was going to wash my one suit of khakis that was almost intact, and I'd threatened him with fate worse than death if he beat him with rocks again. But and that day I don't think I've ever been as ill prepared to receive a senior officer. The day before he was supposed to get there, we were picking up stuff from a drop, and one of my men said, "Good God, Lieutenant, what's that?" And I looked up, and there is the tallest, most imposing colonel I've ever seen, wearing a freshly starched uniform. I found out he'd just put it on outside of camp, and polished cavalry boots. You could actually see your reflection in those boots. Well, I was wearing Chinese rope sandals that they had made out of the shroud cords off of parachutes, a pair of Chinese army pants cut off the knees with a machete, a British bush jacket with the sleeves cut out, and an old pith helmet that I had found on the trail. I did have an American Eagle on the pith helmet. Well, I got over to the colonel as quickly as I could. He didn't stop walking. I saluted, and he says, "And what goddamn army, if any, do you belong to?" And I said, "The Army of the United States, sir." And he says, "And what rank, if any, have you held up until now?" Well, I said, "Second lieutenant, sir." He says, "I should have known. And what is your excuse for your appearance?" Well, I told him all that. He's still walking. I thought, boy, I'm in Dutch now. Well, he was pretty hard to deal with, and he told us that he would sign a requisition for clothing, and I thought, yeah, you will, but we won't get it. But we did get clothes. He had us wear leggings and just fit and polish like we were on parade every day. Lasted about 2 weeks. Then he relaxed. And the reason he relaxed was he began to get officers in for his staff, quite a few American officers, and I had what I thought was a nice bamboo house, and I invited him to stay with me, but he said no. He took one look at that big house up on the hill and said, "I won't have that." He ordered an American Army pyramidal tent. There wasn't one in the theater. They had to have one air freighted out there, and we put that up for him down about halfway between my place and the Chinese headquarters in the hospital. But he never went in the bamboo palace we built for him. All the officers that came to join his staff had to go and live up there, though, and they bitched all the time about having to make that climb. He asked me how often I visited the Chinese outposts. Well, we had them strung out in a wide perimeter around there, and I said, "Only when I have to, sir." I did tell him the truth. He said, "Starting tomorrow, we'll make all." That man nearly walked me to death. He was Colonel John P. Willey, who made general shortly after that, after he left me, and commanded Mars Task Force. He's now dead. I wish I we became very good friends, but not for the first week or two. I had never received a liquor ration. I didn't know there was such a thing. The only time any kind of liquor I ever had out there was when I first got there. The Chinese had invited me to a party. Nobody had told me about a Gambay party where the object was to get the other fellow drunk and make him lose face. Well, I lost face and everything else that first night. Well, I had to give a party in return, so I got my cook to see what he could scrape up, and the Nagas made something they call voom, spelled V like in victory, O-O-M. They would take a bowl of rice beer and put it in one of those large brass pots that are so common in the Orient. They'd put a small pot of this beer in that, and then they would invert a larger brass pot over the top of it and cover it with wet leaves or burlap cloth if they had it. Build a little 3-stick fire. I don't know why, but they always had 3 sticks for a fire under it. And that pot would start bouncing and bubbling, and the stuff would go up, the steam would go up and be distilled and triple distilled, and it might take them days to make a quart of it, but when they got through, it made wonderful lighter fluid. It had a flash point you would. So we'd found some old, Willie had found some old liquor bottles out on the drop ground where the refugees had died, and we had to boil all our water for 25 minutes to keep from getting the various diseases that hit you over there. So all our water tasted smoky. It was boiled over an open fire. So actually, when you mixed a little voom with tea and that made with that smoky water, it didn't taste too unlike scotch. But Willie being inexperienced, and me too, on how much voom you could put to how much water, he overestimated a little, but he said, "Now I'm not going to but tea." Well, before they ate the first bite, the whole Chinese staff was down on the floor dead drunk. They lost face, and that did not do me any good. So that was the last of our parties. So that was about the limit of my experience with the native liquor. Lo and behold, here comes in an engineer officer that I knew named Adam Ford, the old boy from Missouri. He had porters carrying a footlocker nearly full of whiskey. I found out later that was the ration I should have been getting, but hadn't. But we decided to have a party, or I did, and my bamboo house had 3 rooms, 25 feet square. You entered at ground level, and on the back side, everything was hung on a hill out there. You were about 15 feet off the ground. Underneath it was a sharp bamboo they'd cut off, to build a house. We had a big dirt firebox in the center room so we could have a fire, and we'd built seats around a seat around 3 sides of it, and had what we call a picture window now open, and on the rare clear days you could see the snow-capped mountains from the Himalayas. So that was where we were going to have the party. Well, Wetzel says, "Are you going to invite him to the party?" And I said, "No." I knew he was talking about Colonel Willie. "I'm not going to invite him because he wouldn't come." He said, "Well, I think you ought to." And we argued back and forth, and I finally said, "Well, okay, but you ask him." Well, he came. He got drunker than anybody there and was telling us stories about polo ponies and experiences he'd had in the Philippines and in the old horse cavalry days. And one of his officers named Jack Jewett, I don't know why I can remember that name, got very drunk, and as did a lot of us there. And somehow he was crawling around under the house barking like a dog. And all of a sudden the colonel pulls his pistol out. Now bear in mind that this bamboo floor is made out of 3 layers of woven bamboo, starting out with stuff about a ½ inch thick and then winding up with a nice mat. He cocked that pistol and pointed at the floor. I said, "My God, Colonel, what are you going to do?" He says, "I'm going to shoot that goddamn dog down the floor." Well, we talked him out of it. But I had visions of that bullet ricocheting off that bamboo all around it. The next morning we were telling Jack about it, and Jack said, "For a while there I thought I was a dog." That was the only binge we had the whole time I was there, because after that things got very serious. But we had one. Well, we drank all the whiskey anyway. But it was a big party, and they were getting lots of officers in by that time, and most of them were to be on Willie's staff or to be liaison officers with the Chinese units that came through. The liaison officers were, for the most part, majors and lieutenant colonels. And I get orders from General Willey to take up all of their pistols. Well, to take a colonel or major's pistol away from him is that's the grossest insult you could think of. You know. They want me to do that and give each one of them a carbine and only 10 bullets. He wanted them to realize that they were there to advise and not to fight. Well, they raised holy hell. I've never been as abused in my life, and I'd tell them, well, see the colonel, but of course nobody did. But we eventually got that done. One of them who raised an awful lot of cane was a colonel, then a major, Macon Hip. I heard he got shot up pretty bad the first day out. As a reserve officer, I stayed in the reserves until '68 when I retired, active reserve, and then retired reserve for a while after that. We were on active duty at Fort Rucker, Alabama, Fort McClellan, Alabama it was. And I noticed the name of the commanding officer of the camp was Colonel Hip, but I had no idea it could be the same one until he spoke to me when I went by his office one day. And he said, "You're that damn character who took up my pistol and gave me that carbine and 10 bullets." And I said, "How could you remember?" He said, "How could I forget?" He said about an hour after I left there, said the Japs jumped us. Said they weren't supposed to be there, but they were. And said my 10 bullets went as fast as I could pull the trigger, and I fell down behind a log. And so then I saw a little Chinese soldier with a Tommy gun and a 50-round clip, and I motioned to him to stand up and said as soon as he did, he was killed. And I grabbed that Tommy gun and tried to play Tom Mix and got my guts shot out. And said the war was over for him then. So he said then, while he was recuperating, he realized why that had been done, why he'd been given that. And we had a big party at his house that night in, I guess, early 60s down at Fort McClellan, Alabama. I haven't seen him since, but I hear from him occasionally. Didn't see many people after the war that I knew over there. We had good luck with our supply installations. They turned out for the most part in the right place. I eventually got in a lot more men and would set up some places back toward base and turn them over to them, and they did a good job too. You know, that little spot to Gap was almost unbelievable. It was perched on sort of a little shoulder sticking out of the mountain. We were told to build an airstrip out there. We had no tools except hand tools. Nothing with a wheel on it, not even a wheelbarrow. And something I forgot to tell from the Molkalu Manong, I got 2 elephants that we used. And sometimes we'd use them to clear a spot for dropping ground after we decided that's where we were going to use it. They were almost invaluable to have.
Where did the elephants come from?
He had brought them from farther south in Burma from his home. In fact, he had 5 others besides those, and the Chinese just killed them for meanness and ate them. Several times I thought they were going to kill these. We couldn't work them long because they had to hobble them and turn them loose in the jungle to get fodder. If they had had proper food for a full day's work, it would have been the equivalent of about 800 pounds of sugar cane for each elephant.
Well, you could turn them loose in the jungle
hobble
them.
Hobbles on them made out of heavy rattan vines, which were everywhere. They were very good elephants, very well trained and very obedient, and came in very handy for a lot of things. Well, we started, Wetzel's outfit started pecking this. They sent an engineer lieutenant out there, Lieutenant Smith, to do that job, and we went up with a compass and a hand level and mapped out what we thought would be an 800-foot long airstrip, right in the side of the mountain. Mostly rock, but it was soft serpentine rock. And with a lot of explosives, that Chinese blasted this thing out.
Would you like some of this? All right, let's start again.
All of this happened before Colonel Willey got there, and I was supposed to be in charge of about everything that was going on. As far as General Boatner was concerned, he said, "You do what I tell you," and I tried to. So I thought I would be helpful with the Chinese. I went up there, and they were carrying little baskets of dirt, off and putting them down and then rolling them with a big roller they had made and making little rocks out of big ones with hammers. So I asked them if some wheelbarrows would help. Well, bear in mind, we're at a place that has nothing with a wheel on it. Well, they got out their little dictionary, the Chinese engineer officers did, and looked it up and said, it'd be very good. So I ordered some wheelbarrows. I forget how many, I think a dozen.
Where did you order these from?
From my supply headquarters back at Lido. I knew the engineers had them back there. Well, they sent the biggest wheelbarrows made, great big heavy Georgia buggies, and I loaded them on the elephants and sent them up there. And that night when I saw the officers, well, I asked them if the wheelbarrows would help, and they said yes, everything was fine. And so I thought, well, I've made a great contribution. Several days later, I went up there, and it's about 1.5 miles almost straight up the mountain, and of course they could see you coming along before you got there. And when I got there, I saw an unbelievable sight. There was a wheelbarrow with 2 long poles lashed on either side, with about at least 30 Chinese struggling to carry it, with about a bushel of dirt in it. When I told about it, somebody said, well, what did you do? I said, nothing. Nothing I said would have made the least bit of difference. It would have made them all mad. So far as I know, that's the only way any wheelbarrow was ever used on that airstrip. Well, you can laugh about that now, and I tell that only because that's one of the difficulties we were dealing with. A lot of these people had had very little training, and the fact that a man was listed as an engineer officer didn't really mean anything. Now, those who had been trained at the American Training Center at Ramgar, the one that Stilwell set up, that type of situation might not have happened with them. Well, this airstrip had, as near as Smith and I could figure, about a 2,300-foot drop on one end and an 1,800-foot drop on the other. So when somebody flew over and observed it, they said it wasn't big enough. I said, well, I'm no engineer, and the engineer's gone. But it looks to me like you'll be airborne to either end you go off of. So, while I was there, one plane landed to see if he could land and asked us what we'd like to bring, and everyone said some fresh bread. Well, he came back a few hours later with a mattress cover full of loaves of fresh bread, still warm. That's the only time I saw a plane land there. Months later, when I got ready to leave, even though the lead road vehicles had come in, the rains had set in and the road had closed, and I still had to walk about halfway back. They wouldn't fly me out. I had to walk out again. But that just gives you an idea of some of the problems that we had to deal with in being understood. And then language difficulties were horrible. We did not have our interpreters. We had to rely on the Chinese interpreters. And when you made a short statement of 4 or 5 words and he talked for 5 minutes, you knew that you were being misinterpreted or misrepresented. We had lots of strained relations with the Chinese because of that type of situation, I'm sure. Oh, they would not supposed to use porters or coolies. The soldiers weren't. Well, we found out they would stop our Naga porters and offer them something to carry their stuff on them, or maybe stick a gun in their face and say, you do it or we'll kill you. And we had lots of disputes over that. We had lots of disputes because we couldn't get cigarettes in their rations or didn't get enough cooking or some simple, trivial little thing like that. One night they fired all night long. They shot and shot and shot. I had all my men to get into holes, and I finally got up to the commanding officer's hut, and he was under a field table crying. He was a very unmilitary-like little fellow named Colonel Lee Hung. And he was not heard from after that. I don't know where he went, but the chief of Chinese intelligence was a man named Tai Li, or Dai Li, I guess you would pronounce it. He was a very ruthless man, and he had agents in every Chinese unit down to a very low level. Now, how low, I don't know. But when one of them would do something embarrassing like that, like be caught crying in a combat situation. You didn't hear from him anymore. Now, whether they killed him or not, I don't know. My friend Skittles has told me about one I was wondering about, a Captain Kong, who was a very pleasant, personable sort of fellow and spent a lot of time with me. And I had suspicion that he might be the Dai Li man there, and he said he was. But quite often you would have difficulty with a Chinese officer, and then all of a sudden he wasn't there anymore. That would be because they had maybe lost face or done something they shouldn't. And a rumor was that they killed him, and I have no doubt about it. I was amazed at how brutal the Chinese were, and how, with their own people, and what a low regard they had for human life. I saw a major, Chinese major, coming in by himself. He must have been ordered out there as a replacement or something. He was larger than most Chinese. He had a porter that was a fairly large man too, which was a Chinese soldier. He was just a coolie. He was bareheaded, I guess, and he would hit him over the head with a rattan cane every step he took. And this was at the end of about what could be a 5 or 6 hour climb up the mountain. The man's scalp had parted and was down over his eyes, and he was covered with flies and blood. How he was surviving, I don't know. Now, that is not an unusual example of cruelty. One time I was at the battalion commander's headquarters, and for some little routine business, and it was raining and muddy, and his orderly came in with his laundry, and he slipped and fell and got one of his sleeves, the shirt muddy, and maybe some more mud on his clothes. He called him in and pulled fingernails out, 2 or 3 fingers of his hand. And I had to watch that. It's very hard to do. But they could also be very, very charming, very, very polite, very, very gracious, very, very nice. But we were put in a near impossible situation. You went out there to try to have good relations with the Chinese, and I had not been given any instruction whatever on how to deal with them, how to talk with them, other than what Sacerdote gave me there in just a short time. And he wasn't too smart either. We had had a lot of problems with the battalion commander there, a fellow named Major Peng. And we'd finally gotten things worked out, whatever the little difficulty was, and we were being very pleasant with each other and drinking tea, and Peng passed around a small picture about a couple inches square of his wife. And everyone, it was a pretty Chinese lady, and we all said something nice about it. Well, Sacerdote made his remarks in Chinese. Peng's face clouded up like a tornado, and he grabbed his pistol and made it see it. We finally got him calmed down. Sin said, "What did I say?" And the interpreter said, "Well, what you said is this is a very beautiful lady." Said, "Unfortunately, in Major Peng's province, that term for beautiful lady is only applied to ladies of ill repute." Now that may sound like a joke, but it just shows you how treacherous it was. And so many of our people had been given short courses at the Ramgar training school in Chinese. And, of course, I couldn't speak it myself. I couldn't understand it, but you're bound to pick up a little. And you could tell from the way that people behaved that a lot of our people were making a jackass out of themselves by trying to speak Chinese. But that, I did have sense enough to realize that a little knowledge would be a very dangerous thing to have. Also, our Americans made the mistake in dealing with the various Orientals over there of assuming they didn't understand English unless they asked them to. Well, a lot of them, British had been there for God how long? 200 or 300 years. A lot of them understood English perfectly, but they had difficulty in speaking it, and they were embarrassed by their inability to speak it distinctly, and so they would pretend they didn't understand. And some of them deliberately pretended they didn't understand, even though their English was fluent, just so some American would make a fool out of himself. It's very easy to find out what the Americans really thought of them if they pretended they didn't. And our people were so careless, no matter how hard you lectured them. Now, I had been told not to do that. I was told by someone that regardless of who you're talking to, operate on the assumption that they understand English, whether they admit it or not. And that was some of the few bits of good advice that I got. But Americans just made great fools of themselves. But we were so ill prepared not to tell people like me how to deal with foreign nationals, particularly the Orientals, and what to expect, what to do, and what not to do. And finding out the hard way is that's not habit forming, but we did.
Well, I'm surprised to hear that because they knew where they were sending you in the first place, and I thought your training would have included several indoctrination things.
We had absolutely no training at all. Well, you see, the unit I was with was not supposed to be involved in anything like this.
How did you happen to get involved in it then?
I volunteered for a special assignment.
Oh, yeah.
And I asked General Boatner later on, I said, General, why in the world did you have someone like me out there? I'd never even seen Boatner at that time. I said, you had all these people in training for this? He said, yes, but they hadn't completed the training. I said, well, why me? I said, I guess I was expendable. And he said, that's right. He said, we did the best we could. And I had to come back to base one time because I had complained that the way they were packaging stuff and about not having a set of signals on when to drop, because we were only getting maybe less than 40% of our supplies. Something Michigan went out and hung in one of those tall jungle trees. It was just there. And it was very difficult to do. So in midsummer of 43, I went back, and I hated that 7-day walk like a passion. It was still 7 days, and they'd built very little road. And they
Were you by yourself going back then?
Well, I would carry this old Naga and his son with me to carry my pack.
But your other
Men were not with me, no. But it was safe going back. The only thing you had to watch out was you didn't want to get snake bit, but I was always scared I was going to be snake bit. I think we saw fewer snakes than we would have in the woods over here, but you knew they were there. That was not a comforting thought. But unless you fell or something like that. But I had my big drawback was I had malaria. Now the troops back at base were getting Atabrine to suppress malaria to keep you from having it. I did not have it, didn't know there was such a thing. So I contracted malaria, I think, on the way out there. And I had it all the time, and I had to take quinine. And on that walk back, I was very sick, and I couldn't find my quinine. I thought I'd gone off without it. Well, it was too late to go back, and I thought, well, when I get to the next rest stop, we'll have a radio team and a medic there, and I can get some. And we ran out of water, and that was when it was beginning to get dry and very, very hot. And I tried to lie down in a little stream, and the old Naga and his boy would pull me out, thank God. And they got some wild sugar cane to make up the water because I was just totally dehydrated because you've got high fever and trying to walk too. But then when we stopped to make tea, we used some square tins that the British used for carrying your necessities in your pack. And which one of my boys had packed that, put the medicine tin inside the sugar tin. So I was shaking like a leaf, and when I tried to get sugar out of there for the tea, I hit tin. And my old Naga and this boy both just shouted with joy, "Messin', messin', messin'." And I got the quinine, and by the time we made the stop that night, I was getting much better. And I had on a ragged suit of clothes, and the boys said, "Lieutenant, you can't go in looking like that." And they gave me a new suit of khakis. And this picture, I was wearing that suit of khakis, and a signal corps photographer was coming through, and he made that picture that night of me. And later on, after the war was over, when I was at Fort Sam Houston, a signal corps officer I'd never seen says, "I think I have a picture you'd be interested in." And he brought me this picture.
All right. Now we were talking about the picture.
So they made this picture of me with my full beard. I didn't know, but full beards were illegal, but I had one. Anyway, when I got in to base, I found out I weighed 118 pounds with my wet clothes, muddy clothes, and a pistol and 21 bullets. But they still sent me back. While I was there, I had to go up with the planes nearly every day and do the things that their crew did, like kicking the supplies out of the door and all of that. And the boys resented what I'd said about them a little. gave me 2 extra feet of rope, and I lost hold with my hands, and we were banking over this place when I had to kick out. So all of me from nearly to my waist down was hanging outside the airplane, just swinging like that. I can still see every bush and tree there. Believe it or not, a couple of years ago down at Warner Robins Air Force Base, I heard 2 people bragging about how they got even with that lieutenant who'd made a bad report on them. And I walked up and told them, you better be damn glad I melted because I'm the one you're talking about. The odds against finding those people ever must have been about 20 million to 1. But anyway, we laughed about it, but it's still not funny. Another reason I was called back, a man named John Colling, who was a native of China, a son of missionaries, was with the OSS team there by that time, and he was ordered to go on a special patrol with Chinese troops behind the lines. They wanted me to go along in the plane to help them find Johnny. I said, well, I have no idea where he is. I've never been in that country. And they said, yes, but we've got to have someone who can recognize him. We've got to have eyeball recognition before we can drop this stuff. It took us 2 days. Late the second day, we found him on one of those hogback ridges, like the kind we have up here around Buffalo Valley. And the goats had eaten all the grass off, and it was dry at that time. And when we dropped this parachute with a streamer on it identified, and that was a classified material we were dropping to him, an American with him ran out to get the parachute. And we could see somebody shooting at him. We could see the bullets kicking up dust. He went down. I have never found out whether or not the man was killed or who he was. I missed a chance to see Johnny at an OSS reunion 2 or 3 years ago in San Francisco. He came back. He's living in China again. He came back, and I missed a chance to see him. So I'm trying to find his address so I can write him. I just want to know what happened to that poor man. After that, I had to walk back, and it was not long after that when Colonel Willie came out and took over. Pretty soon they got the act together and got an engineer from the Alcan Highway out there, and he started the road moving. And when they started the push into Burma, when Colonel Willie left, I got ready to leave. I said, well, we made out march orders for everyone. And I said, can't find on there where I'm going. And he says, well, you're not. You're going back. I said, you're sick. You've had it. So I went back to base and tried to settle up with the finance officer. I'd been spending large sums of money in cash and just signing their certificates saying I spent so much for this or that. And God knows how many thousands of dollars worth of opium. And I said, now I want to get paid. I haven't been paid since I left the States, which was all right because I had no place to spend any money anyway. And he said, I was afraid you'd ask that. And I said, why? He said, well, you don't belong to any unit. Well, I pulled out my orders assigning me to Chilway-Bu, which was headquarters combat troops, and he said, that thing was canceled the day you left. No one knows why. And you were not picked up by anyone else. I said, well, either pay me or send me home. Well, they wouldn't do that. Well, I wound up with a unit that I went overseas with, but none of them wanted us either. They finally put me and the others who'd been at some outpost with the Chinese in a separate company, and we went a truck company then for the rest of the war. But while I was waiting to get reassigned, the Japs were about to break through at a place called Kohima. And it's the only time any of the top brass ever told us what they were supposed to do. Mountbatten came along and made a talk to us and shook hands with all of us and told us what their plan was, that they were going to let the Japs break through, that they would overextend themselves and whip them right there at Kohima, and they did. But they got very excited about it, and the Japs were making pretty good progress coming in, and so they made combat troops out of everybody there. And somebody got the wild idea that the Japs might be at a little, very small Kachin village up just north of Lido. The only one that I ever knew of in Assam. Nobody knew what was there, but it was. So they wanted somebody to go up there on a patrol to see if any Japs were there. Well, you had to go through a swamp or take a boat upriver, and either way you went, if there'd been any Japs there, you'd been dead before you got in there. But they wanted somebody who spoke Chingpo. Well, everybody who spoke Chingpaw was down in the valley. Well, somebody said, no, all but Lieutenant Allen says he speaks fluent Chingpaw, which was a lie. I didn't. A little. Well, I was sick. Dr. Futch, a regimental surgeon there from Georgia, had told me that he ought to send me to the hospital, but says, if I do, they'll kill you. But everything I ate just felt like I was eating fire. So he put me on a banana diet, just almost exclusively bananas, and I got all right, but I still wasn't all right then. Well, we rode elephants bareback for 4 days to this place, mostly through swamps. You don't know the meaning of saddle sore until you've ridden an elephant bareback. We couldn't use the baskets because of the going through heavy brush. I don't know how many times I slid off of that thing. And the hairs on them are like wire. I was wearing shorts because you can see leeches on you. Leeches were everywhere, and you can see leeches on you. I didn't mention them, but and mosquitoes. But you can see them, and you can get them off either. And I found using a piece of salt, rock salt, was the best way to get them off. But the elephant and the driver were very nice about the elephant would take his trunk and help you get back up. Well, we were covered with muck and everything. Well, the day we were supposed to get there, I told the rest of them, I said, now, when we get there, and there was a major, was just along for the ride, I reckon. I don't know why else he went, but he'd been told that I was in charge. I said, when we get there, if it's like all other Naga Kachin villages, there'll be a little small box like a shrine, and there'll be a cotton thread around the village to keep the evil spirits out. And I said, we won't bother anything or anybody. We'll go in there, and if the Japs are there, well, you're going to die. If they're not there, well, we've made a trip for nothing. But don't go rummaging through the place. And I said, we probably won't see anybody. Well, when we got in, of course, everybody was gone. But the ashes were still warm, and I said, no, we'll just sit here and cook some rice and make some tea, which was time to do anyway. And don't go searching the houses. Well, all of a sudden, I heard a rustling sound behind me, and I looked up, and there was a little kid, looked like about 8 or 9 years old, standing ramrod straight. And in my best Chingpaw, I said what I thought was, are you Kachin? And he says, in perfect English, American English, hell no, I'm an American Baptist Christian. I'd made that whole trip for nothing. There had been missionaries there who had pulled out, and they had stayed there a little too long. And not many of the people came back, so we made that trip for nothing and got back tired and worn out. But when I never felt so foolish in my life as when that kid answered me in American English. And I looked down, he had on a Boy Scout belt buckle. He said, hell no, I'm an American Baptist Christian. So that was my last thing like that. I spent the rest of the time with this separate truck company, and we hauled gasoline and supplies from the most forward base up to where the war was going on. And that was a light duty we got, but we made it all right. I had one leave the whole time I was over there. I don't know whether you have time for this or not, but I got 15 days sick leave. That's the only time I had leave of any kind in 2.5 years. The Americans had taken over a British resort in the town of Shillong, which was the summer capital of Assam. And a Lieutenant Sunby and I, a very large Swede, an ex-Green Bay football packer, one of the biggest, most perfect physical examples of manhood I've ever seen. And they're all thinned right up front. Well, we were sent together to go to Ferndale, the rest camp at Shillong. We had to spend the night at Guwahati. That was as far as we could go on the train, and then we would take a bus from there up the mountain to Shillong the next day. Well, Earl and I knew that we were just about out of whiskey, and the missionary ladies there wouldn't let us bring any liquor in the post at all, so we went out that night to see if we could find some liquor, and we had a taxi driver. And he told us we couldn't get any, but we did find out where the liquor store was, and we went, and Earl had me hold a pistol on the taxi driver while he went up to the house. And it had a little Judas window in it. I think it was the man lived there. So Earl just reaches in through that with that big hand and grabs the poor little fellow and tells him we've got to have some liquor. Well, to make a long story short, he finally let Earl in, and he selected 2 cases of very good stuff, and we paid him many times what it was worth, because the only thing we had was money. But that time I had finally gotten paid. And the taxi driver, we had to ease his pain a little, so we got back, and then we had to hide the stuff outside the mission there because they wouldn't let us in with it. But we did. Next day we took this charcoal bus up there. We had to get out and push 2 or 3 times to get up to the place. But when we got there were practically no Americans there. There were 2 nurses there who wouldn't have anything to do with either one of us. And one lady who, with a Red Cross, a very nice lady whose name I can't remember, Mary something or other, but she was with the Red Cross and had been on the same ship we were on coming over, and she'd been around and knew the people. The only thing they would let us do for recreation there was join the British Country Club, a very swank, posh place that all of the tea planters and the high nabobs and so forth went to for recreation. Cost us 800 rupees. That was about $240 or $250. We were there one night, and that night Earl and Mary and I were at a small table, and the only thing those characters would serve us, even though we were paying through the nose part, was cheap rum, but we were drinking that. He had a British orchestra was playing. There was a large crowd of British soldiers there. And I knew in the back of my mind somewhere that at British social functions like that, military affairs, they played God Save the King at 12 o'clock, and everybody stood at attention and went home. But honestly, I don't remember what that Indian orchestra was playing. I probably didn't care. But the record takes over about now, and it says that this British major reminded me that they were playing God Save the King, and I said that's fine or something like that, but didn't get up. And then he got a little more insistent and said, "Don't you bloody Americans have any sense of decency at all? All on your feet. They're playing God Save the King." And the record says that I told him, "Well, take it easy, SOB. We're doing all we can to save you, damned old king." And that incensed him a great deal, and he knocked me down, and Earl picked him up with those big hands around his waist and threw him head first through the bass drum. Well, it was a disaster. The Maharaja was segregated to a small corner of the place. The last thing I remember clearly, he was cheering the Americans on from this. The next morning when we woke up in our little cottage, Earl woke me up, and he said, "Little buddy, we're in deep trouble." Says, "We're under close house arrest." So they've got Gurkha guards on one side of the cabin and Sikh guards on the other. About that time, a delegation comes in headed by one of these old typical British colonials, retired with the big walrus mustaches and a red face, with a handful of vouchers and a briefcase, demanding payment of just some unbelievable amount, thousands and thousands of rupees, for the damage that we did. Well, the record says I told him what he could do with his vouchers. I figured it didn't make any difference. Well, they didn't court-martial us because the Americans said they had investigated the thing and found out there was no way that Earl and I could have done that damage, even if the girl had participated. And that to a man, the Australians and New Zealanders there had taken our side, and that's where the damage came from. But I know everybody was fighting, as my last remember, which is typical of something like that anyway. So they didn't court-martial us, but for the rest of the time there, they had people that would go in front of us and back of us. They would not serve us even a glass of water in any hotel or restaurant in the province. They would, and we had dates with nice English girls who were refugees from Burma there. They would serve them, but they wouldn't serve us. We went way out to Cherrapunji, way out on over the Manipur Plain, long ways, and they wouldn't serve us there. They knew who we were everywhere we went. So it sort of took the edge off of our vacation, but the Maharaja had us out for 2 nice visits, Alice, and we might have gone back again, but going down a long flight of steps, I tripped and grabbed a large antique urn, and the urn didn't come out so well. I did all right, but he was very nice. He said, "I've got a warehouse full of them, think nothing of it." So, but we didn't get a chance to go back, but we were about out of time, and we had a hard time getting back. We had to get off the train and go to the restaurant car to eat, and it was full of British troops, and they wouldn't let us on, saying they were full. So Earl said, "Well, I'm going to throw them off," and I thought, well, he might just do it. Our car was the last compartment. every time we'd go up and come back, well, it'd take it forever for the train to leave. This time it didn't. We didn't know they'd eat, but this time the train took off in a hurry. They'd put another engine on the back and one in front. We saw we weren't going to make it, and Earl dived into a fourth-class coach, which was just like a cattle car, and knocked some people out, but got on, and I didn't. There are two little brackets on the end of those trains, of that type, the cars of that type. I grabbed one of them and finally got my foot over on the other one and was just spread eagle between the two things there. And all of a sudden I realized that I had heard that Indian trains, in that part of the world at least, are designed with the signals and bridges and so forth to prevent people from riding on the train. Well, my emaciated condition saved me, because right across my rear end something took all my pants off and made a big red streak. But it was just 45 minutes till we got to the end of the line, and it was misting rain, and cinders were all over me, and I'd lost my hat. So I looked horrible when we got there, and Earl had to pry me loose. And we get back to the camp, and there's a battalion commander coming out with all of his following. And I thought I should salute him, and I did, and the walk was slippery, and I fell flat on my face. There I am with my rear end hanging out. He says, "Damn you, Allen, you've been drunk ever since you got out of Burma." And Earl said, "Colonel, if you knew what my little buddy had been through, you'd get out on your knees and apologize." And he told him, and he did forgive me. But that was my last leave, my one and only leave. So it was a sort of a mixed-up affair.
Well, were you over there when the war ended?
No. I came home. I left to come home shortly after, 2 or 3 days after we heard of Roosevelt's death. And at that time I was at Michina, and we were working in and out of China. I did not see much of China. And I literally had to hitchhike home, and I thought, well, at least I was going through Calcutta, and I would get to enjoy the town. I hadn't had a chance to really see any of the nice cities over there. And there was a cholera epidemic on, and I got in one time, found out about that, and went back and stayed. And it took us 55 days to get back. And we had stopped at various islands, Guam, Saipan, Tinian, Admiralties, and finally at Eniwetok, just going back and forth, taking troops off and letting them off. And we finally asked the colonel what in the world was wrong, and he said, there's a big battle going on at some place called Okinawa, and they thought they were going to need more cannon fodder, and I told them it'd be more trouble to get you folks to fight than it'd be worth. So he finally agreed, and they let us go. Halfway between Okinawa and, between Eniwetok and Pearl Harbor, on a bright moonlight night, with the latest in radar on 2 new ships of the General Line. Our sister ship was trailing us. We had no escort. And it rammed us in the fantail on a bright moonlight night, and we managed to make it into Pearl Harbor, and we just had to stay there a day in our ship, and we went on home. But the others had to stay there a while longer. They were taking on some water. I've often wondered what happened to the officers of the deck and the skippers on those 2 ships to let something like that happen. And I stayed in the Army. The rest of my duty was at Fort Sam Houston, which I enjoyed very much. And it was a nice post, and I traveled all over the 4th Army area in an IG inspection team. We were inspecting the units that were being redeployed from Europe to, where the war was over, to the Pacific, and was there when they dropped the bomb. And came home after that and finally decided to go back in the reserves, which I did, and I stayed in there until I retired.
Well, during the time that you were in the service, had you made plans about what you'd do after you got out?
I hadn't really made any plans, but I finally went back to I'd been working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and we were working with the price support and crop control programs, and I went back with them and stayed with them until I retired. Oh. And I also stayed in the active reserve and retired from it.
Well, during the course of all of this, you've answered all the questions that I would have asked you in here. But I'd like to ask you, how do you think that the government performed during all of this, and what do you think the United States should have done maybe that would have made things better?
Well, I don't know. I think the best choice they made was putting Stilwell in command. Stilwell had spent many years in China, He could speak and think and write in all of the dialects. He knew the Chinese better than anyone else we had. And he knew their limitations, and he knew what we could and could not do with them. But all the time he was fighting the bureaucracy back here. There was the strong China lobby. The Kungs and the Sioux were very powerful. And Madame Shek apparently she was from one of the wealthy families too, and she was a Sioux, I think. Mei Ling Sioux or something, I forget her name. But anyway, from one of the wealthy families in China who actually controlled everything anyway. So Stilwell was fighting that all of the time, and then they relieved him, which I think was a great mistake. Was it Patrick Hurley they sent over there to make the investigation, I think, General Hurley, and he was a political general, and he was told, I think, what to do before he went. Stilwell and Chiang Kai-shek did not get along. I don't think anyone would have gotten along with Chiang Kai-shek. I don't think that he was on our side for any reason except he thought he could get more money and more supplies out of us. All he wanted to do was to fight the communists to protect himself when the war was over. And I don't doubt but what he would have considered joining up with the Japanese. And the old puppet emperor, that they had, was named Chute or whatever it was, I can't remember. But anyway, I don't think we had anyone as knowledgeable in our government of the Chinese and their capabilities and their motives than Stilwell. But he did not have the political backing. And when he left, they divided the theater. They put General Wedemeyer, who was a good general, in command of the China theater, and General Sultan in command of the India-Burma theater. And that was not a good situation. I've heard that maybe Stilwell and Mountbatten didn't get along too well. I don't know how much there was about that. Mountbatten was the Southeast Asia commander. And I found him in his talk to us. He's the first one of the brass that ever told us the big picture of what was going on. He was a very personable, very pleasant fellow, and had something nice to say with everyone when he shook hands with us.